Good evening. My name is Guy Golan, and I was asked by Professor Page to spend a few moments with you guys today, speak to you about what public diplomacy is and some of the key issues associated with this term. I've been conducting public diplomacy research and teaching it for over a decade now. And the term public diplomacy is used in a variety of ways by different people. You guys are in a public relations class, and a lot of people think that public diplomacy is equivalent to international public relations, and some can make the case for that. Other people will argue that public diplomacy is the global format of public affairs, another word that is commonly used by different people in different ways. But actually, public diplomacy deals with government to foreign citizen relationship building that has one purpose, and that is to ultimately gain support for a nation's foreign policy. So when you think about public diplomacy, I want you to think about the main stakeholder actor relationship. Primarily, you're going to deal with government who is engaging citizens of foreign nations in an attempt to gain favor for their foreign policy. So, for example, after 9/11, the United States reached out to citizens of many Arab countries, maybe several Muslim nations, and tried to explain to them why the United States is actually doing good in the world in places like Afghanistan and Iraq in an attempt to gain support for the United States foreign policy. Over the next couple of years, since 9/11, where the term public diplomacy really got a lot of focus from practitioners and scholars alike, the terminology around public diplomacy sort of changed to also include such organizations as corporations who are reaching out to foreign publics, or not-for-profits, or issue advocates who are reaching out to foreign publics. And those are really researched and widely discussed in the field of public diplomacy. But for now, for the sake of today, let's focus on governments reaching out to foreign citizens in an attempt to gain support for their foreign policy. So how is this different than traditional diplomacy? Well, in traditional diplomacy, you have heads of states engaging heads of states. So maybe President Trump right now just met with, the leader of North Korea, or he also met with the leader of France, Macron, or the head of Canada, Prime Minister of Canada, and so forth. In public diplomacy, the president would actually go and speak to the people or to the elites of a nation. So when President Obama was elected back in the day, his first state visit was to Turkey, where he spoke to not only the parliament of Turkey, but to ordinary citizens. And right after that, he gave the Cairo speech in Egypt, again, an attempt to directly engage the people of Egypt as opposed to going through the government, which has been the case for many years in diplomacy. All right, so what do you need to know as public relations students about public diplomacy, and why should you care? Well, it's a really cool emergent area, and there's so much being done over here in terms of both research and practice right now. And I've developed a model called the Integrated Model of Public Diplomacy. And in this model, I argue that in order for nations to fully and successfully engage nations, they need to act on three different ways. I want to take you through the three. But before I do, I want to introduce you to a really important core concept in public diplomacy, which is called soft power. Soft power is probably the term you're going to see most in public diplomacy scholarship, and it was developed by Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard University. And what soft power alludes to is that instead of using traditional ways of coercion, right, military, economic sanctions, right, where governments pressure other governments to do what they want, they may be able to gain support for their foreign policy through soft power, which is all about promoting the attractiveness of a nation's people, political values, and foreign policy, right? So soft power is really the most widely discussed, widely used concept in public diplomacy. And there's a very normative assumption about soft power, and that is that if you can only make people learn about why your nation is so great, people will, in other countries, will think more favorably of you and will be more open to listen to what you have to say and more open to your foreign policy in their nation. So in my integrated model of public diplomacy, I speak about soft power programs as the base core of relationship building. If you look at American public diplomacy, it's currently housed in the State Department in the Office of R, which is the Secretary of Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. And there are many, many different offices under this umbrella. If any of you are involved, I know you guys are sitting in DC. The government is a large bureaucracy that has many different offices. So you're going to see many offices that deal with soft power programs, right? The educational and cultural exchanges are very common in public diplomacy. Foreign aid is a very useful tool of soft power in public diplomacy. English language programs. Every embassy around the world, US embassies, has what's called the American Spaces program. These days, there are so many soft power programs that I often refer to them in my book. I talk about them as fill in the blank diplomacy, right? Sports diplomacy, food diplomacy. It's called gastro diplomacy. Anything from water diplomacy to olive diplomacy. Anything is, anytime we have engagement between governments and people in other nations, in any way, form, people refer to as diplomacy these days, right? Digital diplomacy is a really hot topic. Ultimately, there's an assumption. The assumption is, let's talk about educational exchanges, which are really, one of the oldest forms of public diplomacy tactics. Everybody knows the Fulbright program. It's a wonderful program. It brings people from the United States to other nations and people from abroad to the United States. And what is the idea behind it? The idea is that we bring in all these wonderful people from all around the world, and they come into, let's say, the United States, and they're introduced to the nation's values and political culture and freedom of speech and press and religion. And they're going to be here and they're going to be like, wow, the United States is great. And they're going to go home and tell their friends. And hopefully these folks are going to end up being mediators between the American government and citizens abroad, right? If government engages foreign people, they don't have much credibility. But if somebody from your own nation, from your own group says, hey, I was there, it's a wonderful place, you're more likely to be open to it. And it's true that the Fulbright program is amazing. A lot of people who participated in Fulbrights or other exchange programs ended up as leaders of foreign nations. So that potentially could establish a lot of positive goodwill. So soft power programs are prevalent in public diplomacy, and oftentimes you hear people in the State Department speak about them as the jewel of public diplomacy, right? And we put a lot of money into the soft power programs. There's only one problem. Critics of the soft power program say, there's no way to really measure it. And yes, while it's true that many people who participated in these Fulbright programs or other exchanges ended up being heads of state or people in elite positions, others can point to people who came here on Fulbrights or lived in the United States or lived in Europe and then ended up being the enemies of the West, right? Think about the people from 9/11. They lived in Europe for a while before, right? So they were very familiar with the freedom of press and freedom of speech and freedom of religion in Europe, but they ended up attacking the West, right? So there is no real way to measure soft power programs. And this is the ultimate undermining of soft power programs when it comes to getting government appropriation for them. It's based on a lot of normative assumptions. And I'm not saying those assumptions are true or false. I'm just saying the very difficult nature of measurement makes it very hard to really argue for why we should invest more money or less money in these programs, right? So once there is this introduction between governments and people from other nations, well, is that going to be enough to gain support for foreign policy abroad? The answer is probably not. So again, in my book, I argue that most people will never participate in the soft power programs. And yes, thousands of people participate in them. But if you're trying to engage a nation like Bangladesh, Nigeria, you know, India, I mean, these are nations with humongous populations. So even if, 2,000 people participate in the program, it still doesn't cover 99.9% of the population, right? So the odds of those people who came to the US to go around and speak to every other person in those nations, and it's not going to happen. So how do most people in the world learn about foreign policy? Well, what we know from research is that mass media is the ultimate teacher regarding foreign affairs, right? So if anything, let's say, God forbid, something happens right now in Azerbaijan, all right, or Tajikistan or Kazakhstan or any of the stans, right? Well, how many of you would be able to identify that on the map? Well, hopefully there's a student, right, from Turkmenistan in the class right now, but I assume that most American students do not know anything about that region, right? The former Soviet Union republics. And if anything was to happen over there right now, well, how would you make sense of what the event is all about? You would likely turn on, or the internet, right? Twitter. You would go to where any online news source, or something we used to call television and newspapers, right? Where people used to get their news. Well, in many places in the world, that's still the primary place. So governments figure that out, and more governments, and especially see this in Russia and China right now, are not as focused on the soft power stuff like the Confucius Center or the Goethe Center in Germany, right? And all the soft power programs, but rather are saying, you know what, we're going to put our money into international broadcast. How prevalent is this? It's amazing. So most of us know about government-sponsored media, such as the BBC, or you've heard of the Voice of America. The United States actually has something called the BBG, right? The Broadcast Board of Governors, the BBG, which overlooks many arms of American broadcasting, from Radio and TV Marti, which focuses on Cuba, to the Middle East Broadcasting Network, which covers the Middle East, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, and so on, right? There's so many Voices of America. But there's so many other players out there, right? The Germans have Deutsche Welle, and the Chinese are putting a lot of money into broadcasting. They have CCTV, they have the Xinhua News Agency. The Russians have RT, Russia Today, along with various channels, including native advertising and some more covert forms of communications. Iran has Press TV. Qatar has Al Jazeera. Saudi Arabia has Al Arabiya, right? France has France 24. So you see that more and more nations right now are turning to international broadcasting as a way to engage people in other nations and promote their own frames about foreign policy. I'll give you an example. Think about the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, right? Well, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? I'm going to guess that the typical American viewer, and I'm not making fun, it's just there's so many places in the world we can't all be expert about anything in foreign policy. But when the conflict in Crimea happened, how could you tell who's a good guy and who's a bad guy? On the one hand, the Russians argued that Crimea, they're in there to protect Russian-speaking Crimeans who are being vandalized by Ukrainian fascists, right? On the other hand, the Ukrainians said, hey, Putin is trying to bring back the Soviet empire. So this battle over framing, what we call frame building and frame promotion, is at the core of the second level of my integrated public diplomacy model, which looks like a triangle, right? So on the bottom, you have the soft power program. On the middle, you have what we refer to as mediated public diplomacy. Well, guess what? One of my all-time favorite professors sits in George Washington University, Robert Entman. If you can, take his class. He's awesome. And Professor Entman, he's the one who coined the term mediated public diplomacy. It refers to attempts by governments to influence the framing of their foreign policy in international media. Well, back in the day, and still today, governments do that by sending spokespeople or by sending information subsidies, like in traditional PR, to try to shape news narratives. But more and more, you see governments are actually organizing their own news channels, right? To fully control what's being said and how the story is told. The American model, the Canadian model, the British and German models are more of a journalism-focused perspective, whereas the Russian, the Chinese, the Iranian are much more along the old Cold War propaganda models. But that's a huge discussion for another day. Right, so how can you engage foreign citizens? Well, you can invite them over for educational exchanges, soccer diplomacy, food diplomacy, wine diplomacy, and all that. But you can also teach them, talk to them directly through international satellite media, through social media these days, and the United States runs over a dozen language Twitter accounts, reaching everybody, speaking to them in Urdu and Arabic and Spanish and French. You can even name so many languages, and other governments obviously are doing the same. So the information battle over framing, over how we understand who's a good guy and who's a bad guy, who's right and who's wrong, what is the problem and what is the solution, is being fought these days through international media channels. And that form of mediated public diplomacy, if you want to be successful at relationship building, you must be successful over there, right? So we have the mediated public diplomacy, right? And then we have your country's reputation. Your reputation is going to be determined very much by the media coverage, because people learn about the world through the news media most times, right? Very few people have experienced most nations around the world firsthand. Hopefully all of you have traveled a lot, and I encourage you to travel the most. It's the best university in the world. Get a backpack and go and see the world. But most of us are going to learn about the world through the news media, right? So the mediated public diplomacy is almost like a prerequisite to have a positive reputation. Only if you have neutral or positive media coverage can you have a positive reputation. If you have a positive reputation, then you can establish positive, successful relationships in the long term, which in your public relations class, I'm sure you learned. That's the ultimate goal of public relations, right? To build and maintain mutually beneficial relationships between organizations, in our case, governments, and foreign citizens. Okay, so where is this all going? The field of public diplomacy is an emergent field. There are more and more scholars these days who are interested in the topic, and you hear more and more governments who are trying to develop public diplomacy programs. Are we successful at it? Well, in the United States, I think it will really, the answer is it depends, like always, right? The United States, after 9/11, spent billions of dollars trying to engage foreign publics in the Middle East. And after this large investment, anti-Americanism was just as high, right, as before 9/11, right, depending on the period. But the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan didn't help. But in addition, a lot of critics have argued that American public diplomacy doesn't really have a strategic direction. So if you want to take your homework to the next level, or if you're around DC and you care about this topic, ask yourself, who is really in charge of America's public diplomacy? So the formal answer is going to be the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy. And guess what? In the last 20 years, we had such an open door in the office of R, with so many heads of Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy, that it serves much more like a temp agency than a government office. We had people who meant really well, but for some reason, only a few of them stayed more than a year or two, right? But never beyond that, right? The person at the head of the public diplomacy apparatus in the State Department only manages a small part of America's foreign engagement. Think about this. In many nations around the world, the local citizens will meet Americans on a daily basis. They'll meet members of the American Armed Forces in places like the Philippines or Germany, right? Or military bases all around the world. Well, the Department of Defense, the DoD, is a very important part of America's public diplomacy. And somehow they're not under the umbrella of the strategic planning of America's international engagement. So the real question I always like to ask people is, who is in charge? who is our primary target public? Who is the most important people for the United States government to focus on these days? Is it citizens of one nation or another? And if so, are we allocating our resources in the right direction? The second thing is, what is a foreign policy that we're trying to gain support for? These days, we have a new president, President Trump, whose foreign policy is very different than that of President Obama, whose foreign policy was very different of that of his predecessor, George W. Bush, and so forth with Clinton, right? And before that. So relationships are built over many, many, many years, right? It takes a minute to destroy a relationship. It takes decades to build a good one. Well, if you have different governments with different foreign policy objectives and different foreign policy priorities over many decades, you're not going to have a consistent strategy, and you're not going to be successful. So I think that's it for today. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. I hope you're going to get excited about public diplomacy. It's a really cool area of research, and it's a really cool area to work in, right? So you guys are in DC, and they're always looking for interns to work in the Broadcast Board of Governors, right? So the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, knock on their door. The Office of Education and Cultural Affairs, the exchange programs. There are so many offices that you can take a part of America's public diplomacy. And if you ever want to become a foreign affairs officer, go abroad, right? Awesome thing to do. You can travel the world and work and serve the American people, right? So I really encourage everybody to check out public diplomacy and what it's all about.